All right, everyone, welcome. This is Dr. Tameka Ellington here. I am your host, and welcome to the Black Beauty Activist podcast, where we discuss critical conversations to disrupt westernized beauty standards and raise the consciousness and confidence of the Black community. I am your host. For those of you that don't know me, I am a scholar, an educator, empowerment speaker, and I discuss Black beauty and confidence truths that are difficult or that too many are afraid to talk about. And so guess what? I am out of the whale. And I'm going to give you a little bit of explanation about really what that means. What does being out of the whale mean? So when I first started my business, I started it with the focus of first generation revolutionaries. Many of you, if you've been following me, you know that I started a business specifically to focus on serving and empowering students, teachers and staff, and specifically those students that are first generations. And with that, and the reason why that was so important to me is because I'm also a first generation college student, first in my family to go off to college. And so I have a very deep connection to those individuals that are first gen. And if you've ever heard me speak about the importance of having mentors, I had a mentor of mine who totally took me out of what I was originally doing and helped me to see what my true purpose is. And so this particular person, she is Dr. Angela Neal Barnett. She is a professor at Kent State University. She's one of my mentors. She is an internationally acclaimed psychologist and scholar. And back in October, she and I met for lunch. And when we met for lunch, she had asked me how things were going with the business and what I was doing. And I was giving her some updates about how the business was going. And while I'm talking to her, she's looking at me and she's shaking her head. And I asked her, I'm like, well, why are you shaking your head at me? And she said, because you're not living in your purpose. And I just kind of looked at her and I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, you are focused on first generation students. She said, that's admirable. I know you love students. She said, but is that really what you're supposed to be doing? And I looked at her again and puzzled, but I knew in my heart that what she was saying had some truth to it, but I just wasn't ready yet to accept that. And so she said to me, which was a very, very hard truth to hear. She said, you were so ready to disconnect from Kent State University because of the trauma that you faced, that you gave up a part of who you are. And so let me give a little bit of context to that too. So for those of you that don't know me, I actually served as a professor at Kent State for about 13 years and then served in the role of assistant dean for 2.5 years before I decided that it was time for me to go off and do my own thing as a full-time entrepreneur. But when I came into that experience, I became the very first Black professor that the Kent State University Fashion School ever had, and that was in 2012. And when I did that, I had to come in fighting. I ended up having to file an affirmative action complaint against the fashion school. And so I came into this space that was very toxic, left me very traumatized in a lot of ways. And so what Dr. Angela was saying about me being traumatized was absolutely right. And she's absolutely right. I was trying to do everything I possibly could not to have to carry that in with me. And so Dr. Angela was saying that the trauma that I faced had me running like Jonah. She said, one thing that I can do is to help you get out of the whale. And the only way that I can do that is by telling you the truth. And so as she's sitting there talking to me, tears just started flowing in my eyes because I knew that she was saying the truth. I knew that what I was supposed to be doing, I wasn't doing because for various reasons, I was too afraid or just thought that my focus really should be students because that was an easy transition for me since I had been working with students for so many years. And she told me in tough love, she said, it's time to come out of the whale. You are an expert on Black beauty. and hair, and people come to you for the knowledge on that topic. She said, why are you not using this as your speaking platform? And when she said that, there was something inside of me that just clicked. And I again, was just sitting there crying because I knew that she was correct. And as I dried up my tears, I started contemplating, how can I make the shift? I had been so focused for a whole year, really, working towards developing first generation revolutionaries movement, going to various schools and universities and working with students. And she was telling me, she was like, no, that's not what I'm saying that you're not going to be doing. You'll still be talking to students, but your focus will be a little different. And so I totally, off of that conversation that I had with Dr. Angela, I totally refocused. I totally rebranded my entire business to be geared towards Black beauty confidence and teaching about diversity. And in a month's time, I was completely out of the well, or at least I thought I was completely out of the well. I was out of the well, but I was still knees knocking, teeth chattering, and I still had sweat pouring, just still quite nervous, heart pounding, being out of the well, but scared to death. And so to gain some clarity, what I ended up doing was I reached out to another mentor. As I said, I truly believe that mentors are essential to your growth. No matter how old you are, you should always have a mentor in your life. And so I reached out to another one of my mentors, Dr. David Whitaker, also known as Nana Kwa, who actually was just in touch with me today and told me that he just got his Ghanaian residency. So he is now a dual citizen in the United States and then in Ghana. So Nana is a Ghanaian chief. And so I reached out to Nana and I told him, I said, this is what I'm thinking about doing, but I just don't want people to think that I'm a radical. And he said to me, you're already a radical. You're just an undercover radical. You haven't told anybody yet. And when he said that, he proceeded to give me some conversations that helped me to really see through to my authentic self. And he was always right. He said, some of the things that you've done are very, very radical. Like, for instance, leaving my job as assistant dean, where I was making six figures, to start a business where, I'm starting from scratch. That was a very radical move. And Nana basically had me to rethink who I am and not be afraid to show my true self. And so with that being said, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the very first episode of the Black Beauty Activist podcast. And I would like to dedicate this first episode of the podcast to my auntie Debbie, who is now an ancestor. Research on women with disabilities focused on societal perceptions that women with disabilities are socially constructed as weak, dependent, and unfit as providers, and they are considered unable to fulfill their gender expectations as a mother, which includes the sex that's needed to procreate, the capability of carrying the baby in their womb, and then of course, this is true for some people. Some people just are happy, like they just have a hard time carrying a baby, which is true. But society overall thinks that this is something that is just like a blanket for women who have physical disabilities in particular. And lastly, of course, those women being able to take care of their children. And so society sees them as incapable of being able to be a mom. And I just want to say that my Aunt Debbie was a Black woman. She was someone who had a physical disability. She was a single mother, and she raised my two cousins, Nicole and Tony. And I have a very good friend of mine who I consider like a sister, Dr. Stacy Lim, is a Chinese woman. She has a physical disability, and she gave birth to two beautiful children, one of which is my godson, Elliot. And so that just goes to show that what society says about women, especially women of color who are someone with a physical disability, they are more than capable of being mothers. They're more than capable of being amazing, amazing mothers. And so our topic for today is called Calling Out the Lack of Accessibility for Women with Disabilities. Our guest today is a gentleman that I had the pleasure of working with more than 5 years ago. Dr. Stacy and I curated an exhibition called Disabled Beauty, the evolution of beauty, disability, and ability. And we had that exhibition at Kent State University's museum. The exhibition was all about fashion and highly designed assistive devices for those individuals who may have various special needs. So special needs might be a hearing aid or a cochlear implant or a prosthesis. So these particular pieces that we had in there are very fashionable pieces that typically are meant to stand out. Oftentimes people with a disability find themselves trying to hide their assistive device. So if a woman is someone who wears a hearing aid, oftentimes, traditionally, she is somebody who's going to try to use her hair or try to use some accessory to hide her assistive device. But what Dr. Lim and I wanted to show is that those assistive devices can be highly designed. They can be something to be proud of and something to actually show off. And so that's why we wanted to do that show. But we met this gentleman, Mr. Jay Wyant. He is Minnesota's first Chief Information Accessibility Officer, activist, and yes, everyone listening to my podcast, I will be calling you activist, because an activist is not just somebody that's in the street with picket signs. That's what we think of when we typically think of an activist. But an activist might look like a person who writes an essay and publishes it about discrimination. Maybe a person who is somebody that leaves their job when they're being treated unfairly because of their race, sexual orientation, or other underrepresented affiliation. And of course, someone who listens to content like this to learn more about what they can do to make changes in the lives of themselves and other individuals. And so, yes, activists. I will be calling the viewers that watch this podcast activists, because this is a show all about making change. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Jay Wyant. Please come on in, Jay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Yes, so good to see you. And so Jay, he leads the Office of Accessibility at the state of Minnesota. Jay and the Office of Accessibilities, they work with Minnesota state agencies to develop policies and implement processes and best practices that ensure digital government operations and services are accessible and usable for all. Prior to becoming do you guys call it CHOW? You call it the CHOW? Prior to becoming the CHOW, or the Chief Information Accessibility Officer, which is very long to say, so I can understand why you call it CHOW, that's pretty cool. Prior to becoming CHOW, Jay Wyant worked in a wide range of industries, including marketing director for one of the nation's largest captioning services providers. He was head of a website services provider and also served as a teacher of the United States Modern European, Japanese, and Chinese history to high school students. That's amazing. Again, welcome, Jay, to the Black Beauty Activist podcast, the show that is being kicked off. And we are planning to have a great time, and I can't wait to get an opportunity to really dive deep into this topic that we're going to be talking about. So let's jump right on into it. And so before I actually start asking Jay some questions, as I was in the process of working through how to come up with these questions, something really, sparked my memory. And I remember when Dr. Stacy and I were first working together on Disabled Beauty. I remember she was teaching me about the community that we call the quote unquote disabled community. She was teaching me about it. As someone who does not have a physical disability myself, there were lots of things that I didn't understand. And one of those things that I didn't understand, which is something that Dr. Lim taught me that has stuck with me ever since we did that project. She said to me, always put the person before the disability. For example, never say disabled person. Instead, say a person with disability. Or another example might be deaf or partially deaf person. Instead, say a person with hearing loss. Always put the person before whenever you're talking about somebody that has a physical disability. And so that was something that really stuck out to me, because what that does is it just shows the humanness in us all, right? It shows the humanness of everyone, regardless of what, quote unquote, disability they might have. And so I would love for Jay to talk a little bit about yourself, what it was like as a person growing up with hearing loss. So Jay, are you wearing cochlear implants, or are you wearing a hearing aid? Okay, yes. Okay. So Jay is wearing 2 cochlear implants. My sister friend, Stacy, she wears 1 cochlear implant, and she also wears a hearing aid. And so different devices, they do different things, and they help in a variety of ways. And so I would love for Jay to talk about a little bit about yourself and what it was like growing up as somebody with a hearing loss.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Ellington, for having me here. I'm so honored to be the first person on your new podcast, especially on the International Women's Day. So
Yes.
Really, it's a big event for me to be here. As for myself, well, I was born deaf. So we say congenitally deaf, or born deaf. But it took him 2 years to confirm that I actually was deaf. My grandma was holding me, and you remember now, this was back in the 1960s, when they had those big black marble telephones that would really vibrate. And I was my head was inches away from that. It would ring, and I would not even blink. My family knew something was wrong. But it took 2 years, and not until an audiologist, like Dr. Stacy Lim, she's an audiologist.
Yes.
So with an audiologist who concluded, I'm deaf, and here's what you do. So that and other experiences highlighted for me the value that women bring to any critical decision or analysis. Because the doctors are male, they look for things they could mechanically fit in the medical model. And the women are predominantly, the women in the audiology profession predominantly female. And it's not part of the medical model. They are subordinate to that. And yet they are the ones who have the capacity and ability to diagnose myself. And this is not an unusual occurrence. Many times the medical model have not been successful in identifying deaf and hard of hearing children until the audiologist gets to step in.
Wow.
So that was something that was that stuck with me, and that and other incidents. So both my parents were introduced to by the audiologist. They said, here are several pathways you can take. You can go what's called the auditory oral method, or you can go with the sign language, American Sign Language method. They decided to try auditory oral first, see if it would work, and if it didn't, they were fully prepared to go into American Sign Language. But I thrive in the auditory oral environment. Not everybody does. Everybody has different strokes, everybody responds to different stimuli, but I thrived in it. So they stuck with that. I had bilateral hearing aids growing up, and I could hear just a little bit of vowel sound. That's about it. I received my first cochlear implant at age 44 at a Cleveland clinic in Ohio. And now, don't forget, cochlear implants are a relatively new technology. They were really not mature enough for someone like me until the late 2000s. So it would have been great if I could have had them earlier, but they just were not viable for me. And now they become much more viable for children and other people as well. So I grew up in that environment. I grew up listening and speaking, but I grew up reading lips, mostly just looking very intently at a professor. So with speaking as a student, I was the best man for a couple of months, and the husband, he told a story that the way he first met me was our freshman year in college. We were in a 300, 400 person auditorium, one of those big survey classes. And he was, of course, way back at the top. And he looked at me way down in the front, leaning on my desk like this. And he said, who's that brown nose show down there? and somebody told him he's deaf. He tried to read the guy's lips. I had no idea other people knew that they knew I'd be like that they looked at me like that that I looked like that. So which is something that was the Bible tested for me. And as far as your topic of the Black beauty, it's personal for me because I have a teenage daughter. And so this topic of awareness, the issue for Black women is personal to me. And it's also maybe interesting to know that right now she's at her school in tech for a play. She's doing makeup and hair for a diverse cast.
Oh, nice.
Black and white girl, yes.
Nice, nice. Very nice. Well, I'm sure, if she decides to continue down that path of being a makeup artist, we need someone like her, because in theater, in movies and film, Black people with dark skin tones always have issues when it comes to makeup artists having the appropriate makeup. A lot of times the actresses would have to come with their makeup already on because they never would have the right colors. And so I appreciate that your daughter is doing that. And if she decides to stay with it, but we definitely need her.
I totally said that.
Yes, absolutely. So please tell us about how you landed in the position of Chief Information Accessibility Officer. Did you always know that you wanted to go down the path of being able to help the community?
This is Jay. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Like many people with disabilities, I had a very wandering career, air quotes here, path. And also early on in my life, I was resolute in not wanting to be identified as being part of a disability group. Not because I didn't identify as having a disability, but it was important. Again, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the world was very different then.
Yeah.
And it was important for me not to have people perceive that the only way I could get a job, or the only way I could do something, was to work with other people like me. And so I was very intent on proving that I could do and act and be any profession or any level, and that's what I did. But while I was doing that and wandering through different jobs, I also volunteered a lot. And so I was on the board and became the president of the board of a nonprofit audiology clinic. Through that, I got involved in writing about technology for deaf people in a national magazine that had to do with finding hacks on how to make things work for communication, finding other resources like that. On my career side, I, back in the 80s and 90s, had the opportunity to write training on the early foundations of the internet. Well, back before the internet existed, the technology that made that. Like I wrote and created training on all that. So I had a pretty good understanding of how internet technology, internet stuff works. I knew how marketing, I knew communication, I knew how to work with people with disabilities. I worked in nonprofit. So all those things kind of put together gave me this background. Then in 2009, the state passed a law that said we shall have a digital accessibility standard. Mm-hmm. They wrote the standard, and then they said, oh, we need somebody to run this. So they posted the job. I saw the posting and I said, why not? So I signed up. I registered, interviewed, and they said, we were hoping you would sign up for this. We were hoping you would come here. Well, great. So it's been a nice culmination of many different pathways that I went through.
Yeah, and I think that's typical for most people. Lots of experiences that you have, and sometimes, and this is a message for young people, right? So young people, if you're working a job that you don't think matters, it does matter. All of the job experiences that you are able to get while you're young will eventually lead you to where you're supposed to be going. So don't think of any job as worthless, or, gain the skills that you need to get from that particular job and then take those skills with you to the next thing. So that's really, that's powerful. I just surveyed, we just survived a global pandemic that left us all dependent on technology, especially platforms like this one, Zoom and Microsoft Teams. I'm sure that your office and your staff, you all were very busy trying to accommodate everybody. Can you talk a little bit about some challenges that you all had during COVID times in relationship to people with special needs?
Absolutely. But first, I'd like to touch back on what you just said about any job.
Yes.
I was just following a Twitter conversation just the other day where they were talking about first-time college students, people who came from disparate background, and this was these were medical students. And the professor was very amazed at how good one particular person was at de-escalation of angry patients, of angry people. And so he said, "How do you learn this?" And he said, "I worked at a fast food restaurant, observing the night shift when drunk people would come in and I had to handle all the drunk people. Everybody else in the room had no idea of that kind of experience. They came from more privileged, more different kind of background. With him, with his more high-level background that gave him the skill that applied in that way." So I think that's a great story to share about how, like any job, will give you the experience that you would need someday in the future.
Absolutely. Yes.
So,
yes.
So back to the pandemic thing, you're absolutely right. It was crazy. So one day, Friday, we were at the office. Monday, everybody was home. And we had to figure out how we're going to meet, how we're going to have our conversation, how we're going to work together, how we're going to collaborate. Now, state government, and more, not necessarily more than any other entity, but particularly state government, we rely very heavily on vendor provided solutions. We don't build our technology, we buy it. Most people do. You buy, HR technology here, finance technology there, Zoom here, whatever. So that means that vendors need to understand and support the obligation government has regarding accessibility and usability, not to exclude security, data privacy, and so forth, but we are obligated to serve everyone. We can't serve some people. For the pandemic, put a spotlight on this dependency. Suddenly, the government needed tools that work for everyone fast.
Yeah.
Now, updates, we need to look at maybe a fix. That normally took months or even years and had to be done in weeks. And accessibility remained a requirement, but there was little to no time to test or confirm. So Zoom, for example, they were lady provider and provided caption. But I was in communication with them about how to fix that. They would come out with something with only one line, it would go away. Great, one line, I had the readers will not read it. So we were working constantly with vendors to help them figure out how to work the bite out. Even vendors with good track record struggle to ensure accessibility because they were either using new, unproven tools or they were dusting off tools they built 10 years ago and they didn't need it, they put it away and all of a sudden, oh, we need this now. Get it to work. And then vendors with less experience with accessibility took months to learn and fix the issue. They suddenly had to deal with requirements they never thought of before. And that was too late for many people with disabilities. So government had two general strategies to ensure that what they buy is accessible, especially in emergencies. First, require the vendor to provide credible information about the product accessibility. And second, verify the vendor statement and the general support for accessibility. So in addition to getting tools up to speed, accessibility isn't just about the technology, it's about how you use it.
Right.
So we champion practices just as saying your name before you speak. So you heard me, I said, this is Jay. That's because there may be people listening who don't do a very good job distinguishing voices. Now my voice is very different from yours to you, but to other people, they may be more similar.
Yes.
So they need to know who's talking, or they're reading the caption. If they're reading the caption may not identify the speaker. So back to best practice, the quality of auto captions, like what we have today, has improved tremendously over the past 5 years. But we still promote human-generated captioning called CUT. And we remind the media organizers that if someone requests CUT, like if you have a meeting, we're talking about an office meeting or a business meeting or formal business presentation, if we ask, does anybody need accommodation? And somebody says, yeah, I need cart. To tell that person, oh, we got automated captions. That's not appropriate because the person's making an ADA type request for that. So there are things people are still learning how to manage the process and making it work. It's not just the technology, it's the best practices, it's building a culture on how you include everybody in the most effective way.
Wow. The pandemic had such an effect on us in so many ways. And these are things that we didn't, people that don't have to deal with these kinds of issues don't even have no clue that this was also something happening behind the scenes that needed to be worked out so that people could have the tools that they needed. Wow. What are some efforts that you would like to, or that you have implemented in the past? What are some things that you want to be able to implement as you continue on with the work that you're doing, especially in regards to accessibilities for Black women? So some things that Minnesota has done, and then things that you might like to do in the future.
Well, as our former senator, the late great Paul Wellstone used to say, we all do better. Friend, we all do better.
Yeah.
So our state government are made it to serve all people, not just those with a broadband and high-power computer. So that means we need to think about people who may have only a phone. They may have a 3-generation phone, a 3G phone. So that's especially people of color and people in poverty and people with disabilities. So we want to, but one thing we're doing here, I was shocked when I first came to work with the state government back in 2012 that mobile is not in scope. You can't do that. Mobile has to be in scope. You have to think about mobile users anytime you create a technology. The good news is we're now doing that. We're doing a lot more of that. Mobile is now very much at the forefront. But we need to make it even more so. We need to make it the primary requirement that when you build something, make sure it works on mobile. Make sure it works on decent mobile, not necessarily 5G mobile, because you got people in our state, you got people again in areas where they can't get good bandwidth, but they need to get the services. They need to get what they need to do. We're also working on our strategic plan. And while I can't predict what it will look like in the final form, I would like to improve our ability to tell a story or stories that compel the managers of state agencies and their leaders to take specific steps to actively support people with disabilities and people of color and people with diverse people as both employers and vendors. Because we hire people with disabilities. We hire Black women with disabilities. We want them to come and stay and work with us. So the stuff that we buy and use need to work for them.
Yeah.
Well, that's a couple of the things.
That's interesting that you say that, because when I was preparing for our conversation, I was reading a couple articles that were talking about how women in particular have been left out of a lot of considerations when it comes to assistive devices or accessibility, and how important it is to have people who that are living with disabilities to actually work on these tools, because people that aren't living it they're not going to get why they need certain things. They're not going to fully understand it, but somebody who is living that experience will be the best person to be able to create the knowledge, the technology, or to be able to create the assistive device, because they know exactly what they've experienced and they know exactly what somebody else might need.
Absolutely. One of the biggest buzzwords, and for a good reason, we call it human-centered design. And so that when you think about, are we going to build or buy a technology or service? Let's say we're going to create a new service to allow people to get food stamps, okay? Well, SNAP, for example. First, think about who's using it.
Yeah.
And then find those people and then get their feedback on them. What people tend to do when they do that is they find people who look like them.
Yeah.
So you need the human-centered design. The first step is pull yourself out of the equation and start thinking, who are the other? And the people with disability are very much on the fringe of the other. Black women are just inside that fringe of the other. And Black men are in it. So you start pushing further and further out to the other. And the better job you do catering to the needs of the other, the more inclusive you're going to be with everybody inside that circle.
Wow, wow. So the research published by an author, Courtney Long and Associates, they published an article in 2015 that discussed that about 20% of the United States population has a disability, whereas that 20% of white people have a disability, whereas 29% of African Americans have a disability. Are these demographics similar to what you find in Minnesota among the people that you serve? And can you give some context as to why there's a disparity there?
This is Jay. I have not read that research. I would love it if you could send it to me so I can read it. Now,
absolutely.
First of all, I am an accessibility professional with a background in IT and marketing. So I can only say that I've been reading a lot about multiple sources for health disparity, from food deserts to multi-generational trauma. So the clear evidence that people in poverty, which are disproportionately Black and Brown and Native, have higher incidence of health issues which lead to disability.
Yeah.
And the reverse is also true. People with disabilities are twice as likely to live in poverty than those who do not have a disability. The challenge I have had with data regarding people with disability is that due to stigma, many do not report their disability.
Wow.
So the 20% that you cite is, to me, an extrapolation based on assumptions of underreporting. So in other words, a data scientist goes, okay, this is how many who reported based on what I know, and here's how I figure out who's not reported. And so all I can tell you from Minnesota is what I know that the reported. And that shows almost identical rate between Black and non-Hispanic whites, which is just under 12% for each. But American Indians have a much higher rate. They have a 17.4% rate of having a disability. So and that's for Minnesota. But I do see a disparity in very much in how people are treated.
Yeah.
When you have disability and a person with disability with color. I mean,
that makes that makes a lot of sense what you just said, and it really puts things into perspective, because as we know, during COVID, a lot of that discrimination, a lot of that issues that we still face in regards to racism and health care for people that are people of color, we got a chance to see firsthand how we're still struggling with that. And what you just said about the fact that people of color typically don't have the appropriate health care, and which then leads to a certain disability, which that makes a lot of sense that, you know, people that are wealthier, they'll have more resources, they can get rehabilitated, whereas somebody who is living in a, you know, lower socioeconomic status background, they're not going to have the resources to get rehabilitated if it was needed. And so, you know, that makes, I never even thought about it like that. So thank you for clearing that. And so, wow. Research by Angel Love Miles, and I'm going to send, I'm going to put in the description once I get off of this episode, in my YouTube descriptions, I'm going to put the articles that I use to prepare. And so this particular article is one that I really, really enjoyed. It's by a researcher, Angel Love Miles. She published it in 2019, and she revealed that the continued lack of accessibility for Black women, that there is a continued lack of accessibility for Black women. Why do you believe that it's such a disparity for Black women with disabilities? Because I know for sure women already, you know, women already have issues with getting the services that they need many times. So why is it even extra, you know, astronomical for African American women who need services?
That's a great question. I'm sure you've heard of Serena Williams and her birth complication.
Yeah,
And so
yeah, I did.
in her case, race trumps wealth regarding disparities in healthcare. So, like your question regarding the proportion of people of color with disability, I don't think it's one thing, but the intersectionality of race, poverty, and disability, among other things. And then when nonprofits and corporations talk about diversity initiatives, disability is often left aside. When people use the word diversity, they usually think just race. They might think gender.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
if you would have a hierarchy of diversity, I would start with race, and then gender, and maybe a few other things in the disability lab. So that's the big problem. And that's the problem that the accessibility community, which is what I work in, we try really hard to overcome that by trying to build accessibility into whatever technology be built, whatever information be built. If you build accessibility into it, then the people with disability can be included and can come along with everyone else.
Right.
Now, Black women have been historically underserved in the country, and they've often been the heroes. I mean, they're the ones that vote more than Black men, for example, but they deserve to have services that are just as accessible to them as everyone else. So on International Women's Day, I'll be remiss to not again share the need for equitable services for all.
Absolutely. And what you, for those of you that are not familiar with Serena Williams's story that Jay was just mentioning, Serena was, I think she was in labor with her baby and she had some complications, and to the point where research has shown that African-American women oftentimes lose their baby on a higher rate. They often on a higher rate will die during childbirth. They are assumed to be able to take the pain, and so they're not given the appropriate amount of pain medication to make them comfortable. So there's so many different issues that are surrounding Black women giving birth. And so Serena, despite the fact that she's very wealthy, very well known, like Jay just said, her race trumped all of that. You know, the medical staff treated her the same way that they would treat anybody else, any other Black woman, right? Wow. All right, so we are winding down. And so I would like to find out if there's anything that we didn't discuss that you would like to talk about. And then also too, how can the audience learn more about the advances that you and your staff are making?
Absolutely. First of all, again, thank you so much for having me here.
Yes.
I want you to know that while I have the fancy title of child, I am part of a team and a network of amazing, engaged, hardworking state employees who are passionate about accessibility and want to make sure that what we do as a state works for everyone. And so if you want to follow what we're doing, I encourage you to visit our website. I'm going to put a shameless plug here. It's for mn.gov/MNIT/accessibility. Very simple.
And I'll put that in the description as well for everybody.
Thank you. And there's a link on that main page there where you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter. So we talk about what's the latest regarding accessibility. You can also find blog posts there under accessibility, because what we do, we try to talk about what we're doing, what works for accessibility for everyone. So that kind of what I would leave you with, but I would also like to say that accessibility is a fundamental building block for technology, and then accommodation work on top of that. So my implant, for example, they give me sound, but that'll help me understand sound. I still have to do that. I still have to relift. Someone who is blind, they might have a technology and accommodation like a screen reader, but the screen reader won't work if the website is not accessible. So you need accessibility first. It's a basic technology. They need to provide accommodations on top of that for people with disabilities to use the tools and resources to make things work for them. So that's what we're doing here at the state. We're making things accessible to enable people to get accommodations, to get information in the resources they need.
Wow. I have a quick question for you. This just came into my mind as you were talking. Do states ever partner together to figure out solutions? So does Minnesota ever work with its neighboring states, or like, do you all partner together sometimes to come up with different solutions? And then like on a federal level, on the United States, are there things that are implemented that come down to the state level, that you all are also partnering on?
Absolutely. The federal government, the biggest, largest purchaser of technology in the country, not the world. Department of Defense, how big is the budget? Everybody,
Right.
Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, they buy all the stuff. So they have the power through their procurement contract to push for accessibility. Some agencies are doing it better than others. So that's one impact. Plus, the federal government has certain procurement guidelines that they use, which include accessibility. So a lot of states follow from that. And yes, I have counterparts at other states that we network. We meet with once a month. We talk about what's going on. We try to figure out strategies. We go work in terms of buying technology, in terms of how we test for technology, in terms of how we get vendors to understand what they need to do. So absolutely, we're networking. We're trying to leverage it so that, because when I first came to work for the state, they would tell us, oh, you're the first time you've ever heard of you talk about accessibility. We've never had any other state talk about accessibility. They were going, really? So we're talking to each other saying, did they tell you that too? Oh yeah, they told me this too. So
that's funny.
Networking really helps.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. It was such a pleasure. And I'm so happy that I got a chance to meet you. As I said to everybody, I met Jay about 5 years ago. We actually never really met, but we were in communication via email. And Jay actually wrote one of the essays that Dr. Stacy Lim and I had in our gallery catalog. And so it's a pleasure to finally put a face to a name.
Same here. It's finding a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Ellington. I really appreciate you inviting me here. And again, thank you for having me here on International Women's Day.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.
And so as a researcher, as a scholar, it's so important for me to learn as much about the topics as I can that I'm covering. I never want to come to an episode thinking that I know everything, or not having some data to back up what I'm saying. And so one of the research articles that I was reading that really stuck out to me is this one. And like I said, I'll put this in the YouTube description along with some of the other articles that I looked at. But there was an author, Dr. Angel Miles Love. Her article was entitled "Strong Black Women, African American Women with Disabilities, Intersecting Identities and Inequality." And I'll put that in the chat. It was a very, very good article. It will give you a perspective that you would never even think of when it comes to thinking about things that Black women have to deal with. As I said before, Black women are a double minority. They're women, and then of course they're a person of color. Whereas someone who is a Black woman that has a disability, this particular person is a triple minority, having to deal with the fact that she's a woman, having to deal with the fact that she's Black, and then someone who has a disability. And then if you put on top of that, somebody that comes from a poor background, this particular woman has so many obstacles to have to overcome. And so it was really important for me to bring this topic to the surface so that we can really get a chance to talk about things that we don't necessarily talk about. We don't talk about enough how to support our brothers and sisters who may have a disability. We don't talk, and especially those that are people of color. And so to close, I would like to leave you with this quote from Dr. Angel Love Miles. She says, "It is clear that the particular configuration of ableism, white supremacy, and misogyny in society has created barriers to inquiring about certain marginalized bodies. The structures of power render African American women with disabilities as unknown and unrecognizable." And like I was just saying, we don't talk about it enough. These ladies they become invisible. you know. This episode of the Black Beauty Activist podcast was brought to you by my new book. I'm going to see if I can put it on the screen so that you all can see it. And the book is available for pre-order. You can pre-order your copy today. You all should be able to see my screen, but the book is Black Hair in a White World. The book is available for pre-order on Barnes & Noble and Amazon. It'll be available on July 11th. My publisher and I were trying to push so that we can get the book to drop right on the anniversary of the Crown Act, which is July 3rd. So if we can push to get that extra week, we can make it on the anniversary of the Crown Act. And for those of you that don't know what the Crown Act is, the Crown Act is legislation that was first put in place by California and then soon after by New York. And now, as of this past month, we have 20 states that have the Crown Act legislation that is active in their states. And so this particular legislation is particularly for helping individuals who are Black people who decide that they want to wear their hair in its natural state. Maybe these people might want to wear their hair braided or in locks or in an afro, or like how my hair is styled. These individuals oftentimes in work environments, in schools, in relationships, and other areas of their lives oftentimes are discriminated against because they're not following the idea of what society says beauty is supposed to be. And so it's unfortunate that we have had to have legislation put in place for something as silly as this, because this is really silly. This is people asking for permission to be their authentic self. Nobody should ever have to ask for permission to be their authentic self. But I talk about the Crown Act in the book and various other types of political issues surrounding hair, discrimination, history surrounding hair. So I know you will enjoy this book. And I am also in the process of getting ready to do a book tour. The book tour will start in September. I'll be going to various cities across the United States to present and to sell some of these books and sign them for the individuals that come. So I'm super excited about that. But I am going to stop sharing and just wish you all an amazing, amazing night. Thank you for listening. This was my very first Black Beauty Activist podcast episode, so I'm really excited. We have more critical topics to come for sure. And thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like it on YouTube. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Black Beauty Activist Podcast. And if you are in the whale, it's time to find the courage to come out of the whale. If you're already out of the whale, stay diligent so that you won't get swallowed up again. I promise myself that I'm going to stay diligent so I will never become Jonah in the whale again. I will never be swallowed up and running from my true purpose in life. My true purpose in life is to empower others, particularly those in the Black community. And so I will no longer run. And I'm encouraging you to no longer run from what you're supposed to be doing. Always remember, on the other side of fear is your beautiful confidence. Peace and blessings, everyone.